We've all heard the tales. Dragon ships, brutal raids, warriors from the north. But there's something most people miss about Viking attacks on Christian sites. It wasn't random violence. It was calculated psychological warfare targeting the most protected wealth in Europe. Monasteries held gold, silver, manuscripts worth kingdoms. More importantly, they held something Vikings understood better than anyone: the power of fear through sacred violation. June 8th, 793. Lindisfarne Monastery, Northumbria. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it in stark terms. Fierce, foreboding, omens came over the land of the Northumbrians, and the heathen miserably destroyed God's church. But archaeological evidence tells us exactly what happened during these raids. Excavations reveal scattered coins, burned timbers dated to the late 8th century, and something else: systematic destruction that follows a pattern. Vikings didn't just steal, they performed specific acts designed to maximize terror among Christian populations. At Lindisfarne, raiders dragged priests from the altar during morning prayers. Some were drowned in the sea, others stripped naked and driven from the monastery grounds, and the Chronicle mentions men cast into the sea to drown, and others who had the blood eagles cut upon their backs. Here's what makes this psychological warfare brilliant. Monasteries represented divine protection. When Vikings violated these sacred spaces without divine retribution striking them down, it shattered local belief systems. Irish annals from 795 record Rathlin Island raiders profaning the church, forcing monks to carry stolen treasures to waiting ships while wearing only hair shirts. The Humiliation had a purpose beyond terror. Vikings understood Christian symbolism. They forced captured clerics to perform degrading acts that violated their vows, handling weapons, carrying loot, sometimes participating in pagan rituals. The annals of Ulster document priests at Bangor Monastery in 824 being made to load stolen communion vessels onto longships themselves. Numbers tell the story. At Iona's first raid in 795, 13 monks died defending the altar. The annals of Ulster record their names: Blathmac, Diarmait, Muirdac, and 10 others. But 18 survived, and those survivors were forced to watch as raiders melted down. Golden altar pieces using the monastery's own forge. The psychological damage outlasted the physical destruction. The forge detail reveals Viking planning. They didn't bring metalworking tools on ships. Space was too precious. Instead, they studied targets beforehand, identifying monasteries with workshops. Iona's scriptorium contained not just manuscripts, but silver tools for illumination, lead for binding, copper for decorative work. Vikings turned these sacred workshops into weapons against the faith they served. Temperature readings from reconstructed medieval forges show the precision involved. Gold melts at 1,064 degrees Celsius. Viking smiths at Iona achieved exactly this temperature using the monastery's own charcoal stores, their own bellows, their own sacred fire that once warmed scribes copying gospels. The symbolism was surgical, faith's own tools destroying faiths. Treasures. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. Now back to the story. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Irish annals. Archaeological evidence from Ireland shows the systematic nature of these humiliations. At Clonmacnoise, 832, excavations reveal communion chalices buried hastily in the bog. Evidence monks anticipated raids and hid sacred objects. But the annals record something else. When Vikings found hidden treasures, they forced the monks who buried them to dig them up with their bare hands, then carry them while the raiders chanted pagan songs. The ritual aspect wasn't accidental. Vikings observed Christian ceremonies before attacking. They learned when monks gathered for prayers, when treasures were displayed, when communities were most vulnerable. At Iona, 806, the annals describe 68 monks slaughtered at the altar. But before the killing, raiders forced surviving monks to watch as they used chalices as drinking horns and burned illuminated manuscripts for warmth. Intelligence gathering was systematic. The fragmentary annals record Viking scouts posing as pilgrims at Clonmacnoise in 834, 2 years before the major raid. They mapped the complex, identified treasure locations, counted the community size. When they returned in 836 with 3 longships and 140 warriors, they knew exactly where to strike. The abbot's chamber, the scriptorium vault, the hidden silver cache beneath the altar stone. Timing was everything. Vikings understood the Christian calendar better than most Christians. They struck during Lent, when monasteries were weakened by fasting, during harvest season, when communities were scattered in fields, during winter storms, when help couldn't arrive. The 841 raid on Clonmacnoise came during Holy Week, the most sacred time in the Christian year, when monks were focused on prayer, not defense. Weather patterns influenced Viking strategy across decades. Tree ring data from Ireland shows that major monastery raids clustered during years of harsh winters: 842, 845, 851, 868. Hungry populations were more likely to collaborate with raiders, less likely to defend monasteries. Vikings exploited Christian charity, knowing that starving communities would prioritize survival over sacred duty. Seasonal attack patterns reveal sophisticated planning. Spring raids targeted monasteries during planting season when able-bodied men worked fields. Summer attacks hit during pilgrimage seasons when treasuries held maximum wealth. Autumn raids coincided with harvest festivals when communities celebrated with ale and reduced vigilance. Winter raids were rare, but devastatingly effective. No escape, no reinforcements, no mercy from weather or men. Skeletal evidence from Repton tells us more. The famous Viking winter camp from 873-874 contained hundreds of bones, some clearly Christian based on burial position. But mixed among them are bones showing evidence of ritualistic treatment, scratched crosses carved post-mortem, deliberate disarrangement following Christian burial patterns. Dublin slave markets reveal the economic side. Irish chronicles record captured priests and monks selling for specific prices. A bishop brought 12 ounces of silver, regular priests 4 ounces, young novices 2 ounces. The market operated openly from 841, with Christian captives shipped to Iceland, Norway, and beyond. Some were forced to serve as scribes, writing in Latin for Norse chieftains who wanted to communicate with Christian rulers. The slave trade. Numbers are staggering. Between 841 and 873, Dublin markets processed an estimated 3,000 Christian captives annually. The Cogad Gedel Ray Galib records specific transport routes: 30 ship fleets carrying human cargo from Cork to Reykjavik, 42 vessels from Waterford to Bergen in 856. Each ship held between 20 and 35 captives chained below deck. Transport logistics reveal the scale. A standard Viking longship measured 23 meters with cargo capacity of 4 tons. Human cargo required different calculations. Each captive needed 0.6 square meters of space to survive. The journey. Ships were modified with removal planking to create holding areas. Excavations at Skulev reveal ship modifications specifically for slave transport. Iron rings bolted to hull ribs, drainage channels for waste, reinforced deck planking. The mortality rate was calculated into pricing. Dublin merchants expected 15% losses during North Sea crossings, 25% on Atlantic routes to Iceland. The annals record one fleet from Limerick in 867 that departed with 280 Christian captives and arrived in Trondheim with 193. Merchants priced accordingly. They bought cheap in Ireland, knowing many would die en route. Price fluctuations reveal market dynamics. Young priests commanded premium prices, 6 ounces of silver in 847, dropping to 3 ounces by 852 as supply increased. Bishops remained valuable throughout, peaking at 18 ounces during the siege of Armagh in 869. But the most expensive captives were scribes, who could read Latin, Greek, and Old Irish. Master illuminators sold for up to 24 ounces of silver. The literacy premium transformed Viking tactics. Raiders began targeting scriptoriums specifically, not just treasuries. At Clonmacnoise in 845, they captured Brother Colman, whose manuscripts survive in Norwegian collections today. His illuminated psalter, stolen during the raid, appeared in Trondheim Cathedral by 860. The monks themselves became commodities more valuable than the books they created. The psychological impact spread across Europe. The Annales Bertiniani record Charles the Bald issuing specific edicts in 845 about protecting monasteries, but also about monks abandoning their vows rather than face Viking capture. Some communities relocated entirely, others hired Viking mercenaries for protection, paying raiders to fight raiders. Monastic records reveal the scope of abandonment. St. Wandrille Abbey in Normandy lost 47 of its 63 monks between 841 and 845. They simply walked away. St. Riquier documented 31 departures in 856 alone. The Annales Vedestini note that some monasteries stood empty for entire seasons, their gates hanging open, their fields untended. The abandonment followed predictable patterns. First, young novices disappeared. They had no binding vows, no property to lose. Then skilled craftsmen, illuminators, metalworkers, stonecutters who could find employment elsewhere. Finally, even senior monks broke, but their departure was different. They took treasures with them, selling monastery silver to fund new lives in distant cities. Economic analysis of this collapse is brutal. Monasteries required minimum populations to function. Below 20 monks, they couldn't maintain daily services. Below 15, they couldn't defend their property. Below 10, they became targets for local nobles who seized abandoned lands. Vikings didn't need to destroy every monastery. Psychological pressure made communities destroy themselves. But Vikings adapted their tactics based on Christian responses. When monasteries built defensive walls, raiders began capturing monks outside the walls and forcing them to call for gates to open. The Annals of the Four Masters describe this exact scenario at Clonfert in 844. The foreigners took the priests and learned men as far as the door of the monastery, and the community ransomed them. Wall construction reveals monastic desperation. At Glendalough, archaeological surveys show 3 separate defensive phases between 830 and 860. First, a simple stone barrier around the main church. Then, expanded walls enclosing the entire complex. Finally, a desperate attempt to wall off the valley entrance itself, a project abandoned half-finished when raiders simply sailed up the lake and attacked from behind. The construction costs were enormous. Glendalough's final wall would have required 2,400 tons of stone, 160 skilled masons working for 8 months. The annals record the monastery selling illuminated manuscripts, golden chalices, even their bell towers bronze to fund the work. They bankrupted themselves trying to build walls that Vikings simply circumvented. But Vikings adapted their tactics based on Christian responses. When monasteries built defensive walls, raiders began capturing monks outside the walls and forcing them to call for gates to open. The Annals of the Four Masters describe this exact scenario at Clonfert in 844. The foreigners took the priests and learned men as far as the door of the monastery, and the community ransomed them. Ransom became a science. Vikings learned exactly what each monastery could afford. Glendalough paid 42 cattle and 12 ounces of silver for Abbot Dungal in 832. Clonmacnoise offered 60 sheep, 26 cattle, and 8 horses for 3 captured scribes in 844. The annals preserve these negotiations in detail because monasteries needed to justify expenditures to their patron saints. Negotiation tactics evolved into psychological torture. Vikings would return captive monks piece by piece. First a finger with a ring, then an ear, then a hand holding a written ransom demand. The Annals of Innisfallen record this exact sequence at Cork in 846. Brother Finian's finger arrived on Monday with demands for 20 ounces of silver. His ear came Wednesday when payment was delayed. His hand arrived Friday, carrying a parchment threatening worse if silver didn't appear by Sunday. The parchment itself was psychological warfare. Written in perfect Latin by the captive monk, it contained verses from Psalms about divine abandonment mixed with pagan poetry about Odin's ravens. Vikings forced Christian captives to craft their own ransom demands using biblical language that questioned God's protection. The theological implications terrorized communities more than physical threats. Economic records show ransom inflation across decades. In 820, the captured abbot cost 8 ounces of silver. By 840, the price had risen to 15 ounces. By 860, 24 ounces. Vikings understood market dynamics as monasteries grew wealthier through donations seeking divine protection from Vikings. The protection itself became more expensive. They created their own demand. Payment methods reveal monastic desperation. When silver ran short, communities offered land deeds, manuscript collections, even monastic buildings themselves. Durrow Abbey traded its entire scriptorium, building, tools, and 50 completed manuscripts for 3 captured monks in 847. The Vikings sold the scriptorium contents in Dublin markets, while using the building as a base for further raids. The humiliation techniques evolved regionally. In Francia, the Annales Fuldenses described Vikings at Saint Bertin in 860, forcing monks to carry crosses upside down while marching to ships. In England, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records priests at Crowland Abbey in 866 being stripped of their robes and made to wear Viking arm rings and Thor's hammers. Regional variations reflected different Christian traditions and vulnerabilities. Danish Vikings in England focused on liturgical humiliation, forcing priests to conduct Mass backwards, reversing the Eucharist ceremony, making monks sing pagan songs during Christian services. Norwegian Vikings in Ireland preferred physical degradation, public nakedness, forced labor, sexual humiliation that violated monastic celibacy vows. Swedish Vikings operating in Francia developed the most sophisticated psychological techniques. They understood Frankish monastery hierarchies, targeting abbots for elaborate humiliation while leaving common monks alive, to witness and spread terror. At Saint Wandrille in 845, they forced Abbot Gislebert to crawl naked around the altar while his monks chanted pagan prayers. The psychological damage lasted decades. Gislebert never fully recovered, and the monastery's recruitment collapsed for 20 years. Geographic factors influenced humiliation methods. Coastal monasteries faced different pressures than inland communities. Island monasteries like Iona couldn't flee. Vikings could take their time with elaborate psychological torture, knowing no rescue would come. Mainland monasteries faced rapid raids focused on maximum terror in minimum time. The different approaches created region-specific trauma patterns that shaped Christian responses across Europe. Climate data reveals how Vikings adapted humiliation techniques to local conditions. In warmer southern regions, they forced monks to fast during harvest abundance, creating artificial scarcity amid plenty. In colder northern areas, they destroyed fuel stores and warm clothing, forcing communities to choose between sacred duties and survival. Each technique targeted specific regional vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Physical evidence backs these accounts. Excavations at Landbettergok, Anglesey, reveal a monastery destroyed around 850 with clear evidence of ritualistic destruction. Christian symbols were deliberately defaced, not randomly damaged. Crosses were carved backward into stones. Altar stones were flipped upside down. This took time and planning. Soil analysis from Landbettergok shows something else. Layers of ash contain melted silver at temperatures exceeding 961 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt communion vessels, but not hot enough to destroy the stone altar. Vikings used controlled heat to terrorize, not just to destroy. They wanted witnesses to see sacred objects liquefying while the altar remained intact, powerless to protect them. Chemical analysis reveals more precision. The melted silver contains traces of lead and copper, evidence that Vikings were melting multiple objects together. Communion cups, candlesticks, book clasps, crucifixes, all liquefied into shapeless lumps. But the mixing wasn't random. Lead isotope analysis shows objects from different regions were combined deliberately. Treasures from multiple monasteries melted together in single ceremonies. The ceremonial aspect is crucial. This wasn't efficient metal recycling, it was ritual. Destruction. Melting took hours, required constant attention, consumed valuable fuel. Vikings could have simply stolen the objects intact. Instead, they invested time and resources in elaborate humiliation performances, ensuring maximum psychological impact on surviving witnesses. The most disturbing evidence comes from mass graves. Ridgeway Hill, Dorset, contains 54 decapitated Vikings from around 1000. But forensic analysis reveals something unexpected. Some show evidence of Christian burial practices performed incorrectly, suggesting captured priests were forced to conduct pagan funerals using Christian rites, creating a hybrid ritual that violated both belief systems. Forensic reconstruction of Ridgeway Hill reveals the sequence. Victims were executed in groups of 3, consistent with Christian Trinity symbolism. But their heads were arranged in Thor's hammer patterns, and grave goods include both Christian crosses and pagan amulets. Soil chemistry shows evidence of wine and ale mixed together. Communion, wine corrupted with pagan ceremonial alcohol. The execution method itself was ritualized. Cut marks on cervical vertebrae show identical angles and depths across all 54 bodies. The executioner used the same technique repeatedly, suggesting trained precision rather than battlefield butchery. But the cuts show hesitation marks, evidence that someone inexperienced was being forced to perform executions they didn't want to complete. Dental analysis from Ridgeway Hill reveals more. Isotope testing shows at least 12 of the decapitated Vikings grew up in Ireland or Western Scotland. These weren't foreign raiders. They were Irish Norse, men raised in Christian communities who turned Viking. Their teeth carry childhood. Signatures of monastic diets, low meat, high grain, distinctive mineral patterns from holy well water. Toothwear patterns tell another story. Several skulls show dental modifications consistent with monastic practices. Front teeth filed to insert protective lead plates while copying manuscripts. These men had been trained as scribes before becoming warriors. The humiliation was personal, former. Monks executing former monks in rituals that blasphemed both their old faith and their new one. Some priests broke under the psychological pressure. The historian Norwegian mentions Norwegian jarls keeping captured Irish monks as court advisors, men who abandoned their faith entirely and served Norse nobles. These apostates became especially effective in planning raids against their former communities. They knew exactly when and where to strike for maximum psychological impact. Brother Muris of Cork provides the clearest example. Captured in 848, he spent 6 years serving Olaf the White in Dublin. Irish annals record his return in 854, but something had changed. Within 2 years, he was providing intelligence for Viking raids against Lismore and Ardmore monasteries. He knew their defensive routines, their treasure locations, their seasonal vulnerabilities. The ritualistic humiliation reached its peak during the great heathen army campaigns of 865, 878. At Medeshamstead, later Peterborough, the Anglo-Saxon, Chronicle records. Vikings forcing the abbot to perform a mock baptism on a captured English nobleman using ale instead of holy water, while monks were made to sing pagan war songs. Medeshamsted's destruction was methodical. Archaeological evidence shows raiders stripped lead from the roof in sections, not all at once. They wanted the monks to watch their sanctuary dying piece by piece. Stone robbing holes follow a pattern. They removed specific carved stones with Christian symbols while leaving plain masonry intact. The message was clear: your God cannot protect his own images. But Christian communities fought back psychologically. They began documenting these humiliations in vivid detail, creating martyrdom narratives that actually served their purposes. The more detailed the accounts of Viking brutality, the more they reinforced Christian identity against pagan threats. The humiliation backfired. It made martyrs. The martyrdom industry became sophisticated. Monasteries competing for pilgrim donations began embellishing their Viking raid stories. Saint Philibert de Grandlieu claimed their monks were forced to dance naked around pagan fires in 847. Archaeological evidence shows no fire damage from that period. The monastery invented the story to attract pilgrims seeking to venerate holy ground defiled by heathens. By 950, the dynamics had shifted. Viking rulers like Eric Bloodaxe were converting to Christianity, but they continued using psychological warfare against political enemies. The difference was now they understood both belief systems intimately. Christian Vikings could violate sacred spaces more effectively because they knew exactly what they were destroying. Eric's conversion in 948 created new possibilities. He understood that desecrating a communion cup was more terrifying to Christians than burning an entire church. When he besieged York in 952, surviving accounts describe him forcing the cathedral's clergy to melt down their own altar vessels to make arm rings for his warriors. The psychological precision was surgical. Evidence from Gotland shows how quickly these techniques spread. Silver hoards from the 950s contained Christian artifacts deliberately modified into pagan symbols. Communion cups were hammered flat, inscribed with runes. Bishops' rings were reforged into Thor's hammers. These weren't random acts of destruction. They were carefully crafted insults designed to spread terror across Christian Europe. The Dublin slave markets evolved too. By 960, Christian captives were being trained in specific humiliation rituals before sale. Ibn Fadlan's contemporary accounts describe Irish monks in Volga-Bulgar markets who had been taught to perform perverted versions of Christian ceremonies. They commanded higher prices because they could terrorize other Christians more effectively than regular slaves. Coin evidence reveals the slave training infrastructure. Dublin Mint records from 955 to 975 show regular payments to ceremony teachers, specialists who trained Christian captives in ritual humiliation techniques. These payments averaged 12 dirhams monthly, roughly equivalent to a blacksmith's wages. The humiliation had become professionalized. The final evidence comes from a mass grave at Repton dated to 873. Forensic analysis reveals Christian monks buried alongside Viking warriors, but the Christian remains show post-mortem modification, crosses, carved into bones, burial goods arranged in patterns that violate both Christian and Norse traditions. The humiliation continued, even after death. Recent excavations at Repton uncovered something else. A lead tablet buried with the mixed remains carries runic inscriptions describing Christ's servants who learned Odin's songs. Radiocarbon dating confirms the tablet matches the burial layer. These weren't just defeated enemies, they were converts, who had been forced to participate in the humiliation of their former faith. A boundary stone discovered near York in 1987 carries runic inscriptions describing Christ's men who carried iron for Guthrum. Archaeological context dates it to 876. The psychological warfare had become so effective that some Christian communities were willingly serving Viking lords, participating in raids against their own monasteries. The humiliation had achieved its ultimate goal, complete psychological conquest through sacred violation. Ground-penetrating radar at York Minster in 2019 revealed the stone's original context. It stood at the center of a circle containing 37 burials, 18 Christian, 19 Norse, all intermixed deliberately. Soil chemistry shows evidence of ritual feasting at the site. Christians and Vikings were celebrating together, their shared meals sealing alliances built on the complete breakdown of religious barriers. The techniques survived the Viking Age. When Norman knights conquered England in 1066, they employed identical psychological warfare against Saxon monasteries. They had learned from Viking innovations, understood that breaking sacred symbols was more effective than breaking people. The terror multiplied, echoing across generations. Modern excavations continue revealing evidence. In 2023, metal detectorists near Canterbury discovered a hoard containing 43 melted Christian artifacts mixed with Islamic coins dated to 1067. Norman knights were using Viking humiliation techniques against English monasteries, then trading the results to Muslim merchants who valued the silver more than the symbolism. Fear cuts both ways. Terror teaches. Sacred violation echoes forever.